Thank you all for joining us this morning. We're really excited to have all of you. Before I introduce our guest, I would like to thank the Council in the Classroom sponsors, the Dennis and Phyllis Washington Foundation, BNSF Railway Foundation, Allegiance, First Security Bank, and Trail West Bank. The U.S. Institute of Peace is currently implementing a two-year project called Women Preventing Violent Extremism, which aims to prevent and reduce the threat of violent extremism in the Horn of Africa, specifically Ethiopia, Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania, by supporting women and girls as change agents. This project seeks to empower leaders and women's organizations that work at the community level on the issue of violent extremism by equipping them with skills, tools, and information, connecting women regionally to learn each other's experiences and amplify their collective voices, and supporting women's advocacy for more inclusive and effective programming and policymaking at the local, national, and regional levels. Nicoletta Barbera is a program officer for the Africa programs at the United States Institute of Peace. She currently serves as the lead for USIP's Women Preventing Violent Extremism program in the Horn of Africa and the Sahel. In her previous role in the USIP Africa team, she managed USIP's South Sudan programmatic portfolio. Nicoletta joined USIP in 2012 as a research assistant for the Gender and Peacebuilding team. I'll now turn this over to Nicoletta.
Nicoletta, before you get started, I just want a thumbs up from students if they can hear and see. Let's just double check. All right, we're good to go. Take it away.
Thanks, everyone. Hi, it's such a pleasure to be here. It's a little overwhelming to see so many interested students in this work, so thanks so much for your time this morning. So I'm currently sitting here in my office in Washington, D.C. You can maybe see a little bit behind me of our building. It's very open, very clear and transparent, just like peace building should be. So I just wanted to tell you a little bit about me first, a little bit about USIP, and then talk a little bit about the project that I work on, and then save a lot of time for questions and hopefully some conversation with you all. I'd also love to hear a bit about what you guys are doing. So a bit about me. I have been at USIP for 8 years, which seems like a really long time. That's the bulk of my professional career. I'm from Baltimore, Maryland, originally. I'm not sure if any of you know where Baltimore is, but it's all the way on the East Coast, about an hour north of DC. I'm also partly half Italian, so spent a lot of my summers growing up seeing my family in Italy, in Europe, and so that was my first exposure to international things. And when I was in high school and college, I was dead set on being a doctor. I thought that's what I was going to be. I didn't even know that international affairs existed or that peace building was something that existed. It wasn't until my junior year of college that I learned about international affairs and decided that that's something that interested me and aligned with my background. So I switched my major. I switched from medical school, from medicine and biology to international affairs and French, studied abroad in Paris, and decided to pursue this. And then I moved to DC, went to grad school, and found a job at USIP. So I was really lucky in that sense. USIP has this really cool program where if you're a student in grad school, you can be a research assistant at USIP. It's kind of like an entry-level job. And you can work part-time and be in school full-time and do both, and they pay you, which is also really nice. It's not a free internship. So that's a lot of how some students like enter into USIP and then move up the ranks. So I've been here for 8 years. I worked on the gender and peace building team before I moved over to the Africa program. I decided that I wanted to focus my expertise. I was doing kind of thematic work, looking at what are the roles of women and men in peace and conflict, but I realized I wanted to focus it in on a specific part of the world. So right now I'm working on the Africa program, and the project that I'm working on is, as was mentioned in the introduction, it's in 4 countries, Kenya, Ethiopia, Tanzania, and Uganda, but I was going to focus on Kenya specifically. Before I go on, I wanted to ask you guys if you know where Kenya is.
Let's do a thumbs up or thumbs down if you know where Kenya is.
A little hard to see. Oh,
Oh, they've got kind of half and half there. Looks
Yeah.
like it's each. Looks like Gardner's good to go. Okay.
So I was given this really cool globe by a colleague, and I'm going to show you if I can. So if you can all see, this is the United States, and Montana is up here. And if we go to the complete opposite side of the world, this is Africa.
Yeah.
Here's Africa, and Kenya is all the way on the east side of Africa. So we call this area the Horn of Africa because Africa kind of looks like a rhino with its head down, and then this would be the Horn. So the Horn of Africa in Kenya is a democracy in East Africa. So I've been to Kenya at this point 15 times for this work. Does anyone know anything about Kenya, like what it's known for, what it's famous for?
Okay, let's take some turns here and start with Gardner. Is there a student who can tell us a little bit about what they know about Kenya?
Anything at all.
And say your name first so we can know who we're talking to.
Hey. My name is Xander from Gardner. So let's see, I went to Kenya about 6 or 7 years ago. And one of the big takeaways from that was just their very large and open wildlife reserves that they have there. And a lot of the conservation work that they're doing to protect animals there. Yeah, I guess that was the big takeaway. As far as human interactions or conflict, I didn't really come into much exposure with that. And I know that there have been some rising issues in Kenya since then. So I guess it'd be interesting to learn about what's happening and what USIP and other organizations are doing to solve that, and maybe even just a background on what those conflicts are.
Sure.
Thank you, Xander. That's great. Go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to say that was going to be the thing that I was going to mention first. I'm a huge animal person, and to me, seeing the incredible wildlife that is in Kenya, you're right, Xander. They have really large animal preserves where they protect, they conserve, they work really, really hard to make sure the animals are protected, saved, that there's no violence that affects or spills over into the animal reserves. They have huge national parks. So this past year was, after being there for 15 different trips, this past year was the first time I was able to do a safari, and I saw all the animals that I could have ever dreamed of seeing in real life. So it was an incredible experience. But you're right that Kenya has also suffered some violence. I think something that is maybe made the most international news was there was political violence around their elections in 2007, at the end of 2007, where a lot of people were hurt and some people died. But since then, the government's worked really hard to make sure, and not just the government, but support from the international community as well. Other organizations around the world who work on peace building and conflict resolution have helped to put in place measures to stop that violence from happening. So a lot of that is educating voters, making sure everyone has access to vote if they want to, and just really reaching out to the community. So since then, every election, there's been 2 other elections, national elections since then, and we've seen the violence just go down. So that's really, really great. So my project, though, looks at an issue area that kind of came to a head between 2009 and 2013. There were a series of attacks that were motivated by terrorists, and a lot of the terrorists come from neighboring Somalia. So Somalia shares a border with Kenya, and Somalia has a lot of problems going on. I won't get into it, but there's spillover from that country, and people that are trying to get their points across will sometimes resort to violence in Kenya or right on the border. So Kenya is trying to build resilience. This is a term that peace builders use a lot. You may know what it means, but resilience, like this community's innate ability to not put in place physical barriers, but work as a community cohesively to stop the spillover effects from conflict around them. So that's what USIP is trying to do in the Women Preventing Violent Extremism project. Specifically, we're working with women to do that. And I want to say that the reason we're doing that is because, and not working, it's not men preventing violent extremism, which is, USIP does a lot of work with men, women, and young people. This project works with women specifically because often we found that in conversations about violent extremism, and I'll define that in a moment, or terrorism, women are left out. Women are left out of a lot of peace processes, actually. They're kind of the most forgotten actor in conflict resolution. And so USIP and a lot of other international organizations try and push for women to be engaged, not just at the political level, like talking to members of the government, but also at the community level, working with men, women, and young people so that they all know that women have a voice in their community. So I can stop there really quickly just to see if there are questions about anything I've said. I know I use the term violent extremism and I haven't really defined that. I'm happy to do that, and then I'll take the questions, or if there are any.
Okay, okay, let's pause for a second. And Nicoletta, just a point of information for you, Zach in Gardner is right at the gates of Yellowstone Park. So that preservation of species and stuff is hitting home pretty hard, I'm sure, with them. So let's go to St. Charles and see if you have either something that you know about Kenya or a question so far for Nicoletta. Go ahead, Mr. Moore, your call.
Matthew does, yeah. Matthew, go ahead, take it away.
What kind of question was that?
A lot of information.
Be shy.
I don't have a question.
No, we don't know what to talk about.
No questions? No comments yet?
How did I get pulled into this?
Okay, we can come back to you.
Mr. Rhodes, I want to see if
Mr. Rhodes, do you have,
microphone.
in Roy, do you have questions? If you do, type them in the chat
or
box.
he can try his microphone.
Or you can try your microphone and just talk, even if you don't have a camera. Not so far, and I'm sure we'll have Bozeman in a minute. So let's go ahead and continue.
So one thing I was thinking that maybe it would be a good time to pause and have some small group reflection, or even pairs reflection on why you all think that we work with women and what women might be able to do in peace or in conflict resolution. Like, why are we specifically working with women? What are their roles? Or even what are their roles that you see in your lives?
Great, so let's take about 1 minute and turn to elbow partners and discuss that idea of why are women a focus, and especially thinking about your own community, why would women help make your community more resilient? Go ahead and turn and talk, and then we'll take some responses.
That's good.
Hey, take 10 seconds, and let's go ahead and start with Gardner. What kinds of ideas did you come up with there?
We had the question about when Audrey. Okay, we also were wondering why the focus on women before you posed that. Who wants to come and talk? Get over here, Audrey.
Don't be shy.
Don't bite. You can't bite through the camera.
Yeah, no virtual biting.
And there's really no wrong answer because there are so many answers possible for this.
Okay. Hi,
There you go.
my name's Graham, and we were talking that part of the reason they might be focusing on women in this situation is because generally women have a more nurturing place in a society, and therefore, in the case of peace building, it would make more sense to have that more of a maternal energy in that area of international conflict.
Great. Thank you. Is there another group that has a different idea?
Why does it do that? Where did it go?
We still see you.
It's right, like right there.
We love technology, right? Does anybody, any other group have another idea? We can see and hear you, so.
Let's go. They've muted their microphones. Let's go ahead.
Oh, okay. We'll go ahead to St. Charles then. Mr. Moore's class, did your students have an idea or two?
One of the sisters had something to say. Sister Cheryl.
Great.
I just think women by nature are relationship builders. So in building peace and safe environments, that they often extend to, they want to build relationships rather than just be task oriented or doers.
Okay. Good thinking. Any of the students want to chime in too? How do women play a role in your families? Let's do a thumbs up, thumbs down. Are women's roles in your community important? Yes? Or not as, yeah. Okay, good. Good thinking. Do we have any on the chat?
Not on the chat, but Mr. Rhodes, if you'd like to, I can unmute you and let's see if your class has any thoughts. All right, you are unmuted.
Mr. Rhodes.
Oh, I'm not sure if the technology is working. You can go ahead and type in if you have some questions.
Sure. So let's go ahead, and I have a feeling Bozeman's going to join us in a few minutes too. So let's go ahead and continue, and then we'll get their perspective if they join.
Yep.
When they join.
So I was going to say that it seems like both classrooms have a potential role in peace building because you both touched on two really great points. The first on kind of women having maybe more maternal energy or creating a more nurturing environment. While that's not always the case, we definitely see that in our work. So one example, through this project, women have been, USAP works with women who are not members of the government, so they're part of civil society, so non-governmentally affiliated. Maybe they're working as teachers, or they're working as church leaders, or they're working on doing programs in their community, or even just anything, just not working for the government. So we work with them to train them to hold dialogues in their communities. And these dialogues are meant to kind of create relationships between women, young people who are maybe most at risk of entering some of these terrorist groups or joining these terrorist groups because they're looking for an outlet for their grievances or something that is angering them. So these dialogues bring together women, young people, and police or local members of the security world to break down some of that mistrust that exists and try and build good relationships at the community level. And USAP has found that women are really well placed to do this because they create an environment where people feel safe to talk about their issues, where people feel that there's no one judging them, or where they feel like there's not going to be something bad that happens to them if they share something. So they're able to create this safe space, and that allows for free-flowing conversation. And people feel just also the ability to just talk to someone about what you're going through and what you're thinking about helps people feel better. And it's almost like a little counseling session, but it's done by women in a safe space as a group and not one-on-one, where people feel maybe more targeted. So that's an excellent thing. And the thing about relationship building, women are able, that's another excellent point, that women are kind of relationship builders. And we've found that when we work with women, these networks kind of form where women are talking to each other all the time about what's working or what's not working. What can we be doing better to prevent terrorism in our community? And they form these networks and they're sticking together and learning from each other. So those relationships are really important in this field. So are there any comments or questions about that?
Yes, we do have a comment on the live stream.
Yes, and so this is Berkeley from Roy, and Berkeley says that he's speaking from experience, that women in Africa are allowed to take care of the home and children, and women involved in politics in Africa are very rare, and they're often viewed negatively when they are politically involved.
Did you hear all that?
Yes. I see more, that there's more typing.
Yep, it says that he spent 2 weeks in Uganda in June. He got back in January for another, and he goes back in January for another 2 weeks.
Wow.
Wow.
So, I mean, that's a... Really,
I'm sorry, Berkeley, I apologize. Berkeley is a she.
Yes.
Oh, Berkeley is a she.
That's really cool that you've been to Uganda. So that's a really great point. And USAP and other organizations have to think about this. You know, sometimes the work we're doing is coming from a mindset from maybe a US mindset where we see women's involvement in politics as a totally normal thing. So we have to stop for a second and ask ourselves, well, what is the context in which we're working? Are our assumptions the same or different based on the context in which we're working? So you're right, in East Africa and in a lot of other countries around the world, women aren't as active in politics, and women aren't as active in peace or conflict resolution. And there's almost a mindset that has to change. And USAP says that sometimes can take a generation to change. But so that's another thing about what USAP does is while we're working at the community level to try and build the confidence of women to ask for what they want to see change or happen to do their work, we also work at the political level. So we're trying to link these women and men who are allies of women's empowerment. We link them with members of their own governments. So we host these dialogues that I mentioned before. We also will host dialogues with members of the Office of the President of Kenya or the Office of the Vice President of Kenya, or we find women who are members of parliament, kind of like members of Congress. We find women who are in high levels of government, bring them all together to talk about these issues, to make it seem more natural, to make it seem more normal that these conversations are happening with women there. But it's not an easy thing, and it's something that we do have to deal with and work through and talk through a lot in our work.
Whoa, you can ask nicer than that.
Please. Hi, Bozeman.
Hello.
Howdy.
We can hear you. Okay, we can see you too.
I'll mute us.
Okay.
Okay.
You know, we do have a question on the stream too.
Great. We have one more question on the live stream.
Two questions actually.
Oh,
so
two.
The first is, what kind of terrorism are you fighting?
Ooh, good question.
That's a good question. So I mentioned, and I want to say that it's not so much USAP that's doing any fighting. I know that's not what the question meant, but I just want to clarify that it's, you know, the women, the communities in Kenya are protecting themselves against terrorism, and the terrorists that we're talking about they're called Al-Shabaab. It's a terrorist group that's based in Somalia, right on the east coast of Kenya. And they work independently, but research shows that they're affiliated with terrorist groups out of the Middle East as well, and affiliated to Al-Qaeda, which you may have heard about. So they're pretty bad guys, and it's always interesting because the terrorist groups are always changing a bit, and their tactics are always changing. So this field called countering violent extremism, that's kind of the field that I'm working in, always has to be learning about what are the approaches that are needed to prevent this terrorism from spilling into certain areas, because terrorists are always changing their tactics based on what the international community is doing.
Wow. Thank you. One more question from the stream?
I think she answered it
Okay,
within that one.
great, great. So, Bozeman, did you have any initial questions? We're talking about Nicoletta's work in empowering women in Kenya specifically, and how they're getting women who aren't in political power, but just in the communities to help build resiliency within the community. So did you have a question at the right now, or would you like to wait for a minute, Ms. Wallner-Drake?
I think we'll just listen for a minute. That's okay.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Go ahead, Nicoletta.
So I wanted to give an example of maybe one or two examples of how this is working in Kenya in two locations. One location is an area, a city called Mombasa. It's in southeastern Kenya. It's a beach town where they have a lot of really wonderful things. They have a lot of seafood and a lot of beautiful beaches, and it's touristy. But they've seen a decline in tourism because of the concern that this terrorism exists there. And so we're working with a group of women in Mombasa through this program. And one of the women, her husband, was actually a terrorist. And he was going to commit an act of terrorism, not in Kenya, but in Uganda. The police caught him before he did it. He's in jail now for the rest of his life. But he didn't actually do the terrible act. He was caught right beforehand. But this woman who was married to this guy was so devastated at learning about this. She had no idea that this was happening. She was at home. She was taking care of the kids. She didn't know where he was every day. And so she was looking for answers after this and was facing a lot of bullying from members of her community because she was married to someone who was about this terrible human being, or this man who was lost in that moment and had joined this group. So she felt her and her kids were bullied actually a lot, and she didn't know what to do or where to turn. But through this program that USIP has been working in, she was able to join this women's group, and now for the last 6 years has felt like she has people who understand her, people who know what she's going through, people who have experienced similar things to her. And she's now working every day to try and prevent that from happening to other people in the community, to try and prevent the bullying associated with it, but to also prevent other young men from going down the route of her husband. And one thing that sometimes will happen is that if a family is bullied so much from from being associated with being a terrorist, then the family feels like they don't have any allies in their community. They don't have anyone to turn to. And you find that sometimes the kids might end up joining a terrorist group too because they don't know who else to turn to. So it was really important for her to step up for her family and prevent that cycle from happening. So that's something that always sticks in my mind as an example of why this works. Another example is in a different part of Kenya in the north. It's called a town called Garissa. And that's the closest town to the border with Somalia, the country where the terrorists mostly come from, on the northeastern part of Kenya. There was a really, really big terrorist attack in 2015 there, where 150 people in the community died. And it was a tragedy. It was actually in a university. So it was really, really a devastating tragedy. The women, we had been already working with women in Garissa to train them in being responsive to the threat of terrorism and to look for signs if it might be happening. So we had just started working with them in 2015, but in 2016, they learned of another attack that was about to happen. But because of the relationships that they had formed with the police and with young people in their community, like in those dialogues that I mentioned earlier, they were able to learn that another attack was going to happen, and they went to the police and were able to prevent it from happening in a way where no one got hurt. And that's another example of why those relationships that women are able to build between so many different members of the community are so important to preventing terrorism. So those are two examples that to me stick in my mind of how the role of women can be really critical in preventing terrorism and extremism in Kenya. But also these stories, you hear them in other countries too. This isn't an issue that's specific to Kenya. Unfortunately, you hear of terrorism in other locations around the world too. But are there any questions about either of those stories or any comments?
You know what I'd like to do is take another minute and do another elbow partner, because that was a lot of really amazing information. And we'd already asked about why women. And so now with those examples, I'd like to have the students turn and talk for about a minute about what they just heard and how, if that changes what they thought initially about why women, and what questions that might bring up to kind of let them process a little bit. So take about a minute, and then we'll come to a round robin of each of the schools.
Sounds good.
Okay, it looks like Gardner is ready to do some heavy duty thinking. So we'll go to Gardner, and then St. Charles, and then Bozeman and Roy in the meantime. So go ahead, Gardner. What are you thinking there?
One of the interesting conclusions that we came to is that one of the groups that are largest affected by terrorism are women and children, as mentioned in the two examples that were provided, in that while many young men are committing these acts, a lot of times what happens to the family and those are affected can be a lot more long-lasting and worse. One question that maybe you could answer is, do you find that working with women helps communities reconcile with terrorism and forgive past wrongdoings to move forward? I know that that's a very large problem in a lot of Middle Eastern countries, in not being able to move past these problems created there.
Mm-hmm. That's a great question.
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead and respond, Nicoletta.
Oh, okay. So it's true that women and children are often the largest group of victims of terrorist attacks. So that's another reason that we wanted to work with women, because they're often feeling like, well, we're affected so much, we need to be part of the solution as well, to feel like we're contributing. So that's a really, really great thought that you guys had. Your question about working with women, whether that helps communities reconcile, that is a wonderful question, and something that we don't, not just USIP, but I don't think the international community has a really solid answer to. And it's something that we're struggling with, because forgiveness is one of the hardest aspects of this work. As you can imagine, it's really hard to move on from a terrorist attack. It's really hard for a community to heal when members of their own community or a neighboring community do such terrible things. But we have found that through some of the spaces that women create, where some of them are only women talking with women, and some of them engage also men, young people, police, like I mentioned. Those conversations that kind of bring out into the open some of the things that people are feeling and thinking, some of the anger, that does help heal and help communities move on. So in a way, I think that women do this and are helping. Then there are, I don't want to get into it too much, but there are a lot of efforts that look at this kind of from a political aspect of like retribution or reparations, funds given from the government or to apologize for things that have been done, for wrongdoings. But USIP doesn't work so much in that space. We're more in the space of, at the community level, having these women leading these conversations amongst members of their community to talk about some of the anger and some of the frustration they're feeling, to make sure these things don't happen again and again. So yes, they are doing that at the community level.
Great, thank you. Let's go to St. Charles and see if you all have a comment or question or thoughts about this.
Anybody?
Yeah, do you have questions or comments?
Actually, I think I do.
Think of this work. Do you think it's something that you would be interested in?
The question I have is, how can women, if since we're talking about the Horn of Africa, however, in our own communities, empower themselves to do what y'all are doing over there in Africa, to empower the women here with the younger generation to stand up for themselves in certain areas around the United States that we have problems with, as well as helping with in Africa?
That's a great question. And, as an American citizen, I often think about this because my work focuses internationally, and I have USIP was, we've been around for 35 years, and our mandate in how we were created is to only focus internationally, because there are so many other organizations that are doing this work in the US. But I think about this question a lot because oftentimes if something happens here, bad happens here, or if I don't see a lot of women entering politics in the US, I'm like, how do I share these lessons that I'm learning from around the world with the US? So one thing USIP does is that we have a lot of events, a lot of public events, and a lot of publicly available reports and research on our website, and we try and do briefings like this so that people know about the work and they know that it does work. And that they can share some of these stories with people in the US about how strong women can be and how they can make a difference in their communities if they stand up for what's right, if they stand up for peace. And so my hope is that people will share these stories with their families, with their friends and neighbors, and see that peace is actually possible, not just internationally, but in the US too.
Great, thank you. Let's go ahead and move to Bozeman and Miss Waldner-Drake's class. Do you have questions or observations?
Okay, actually,
yeah, so I had a question. Because of the the deeply rooted oppression that women have experienced in these countries, do you ever find that it's hard to mobilize them and to motivate them to come to positions of power, or does it seem like something that they've kind of always been waiting for?
So just to make sure I heard your question, did you say, was it that in some places it might be difficult to find women or mobilize women into doing this work or to entering positions of power? And what do we do about that?
Yes.
Good question. It's actually a huge part of what we think about when we're designing programs like this. Because first of all, we don't want, USIP wouldn't work in a place that doesn't want this type of programming to happen. It's not like we would go into Kenya as an organization and say, hey, we're going to do this work. Who wants to join? That's not how we work. We partner a lot. So USIP finds other organizations around the world that are doing this work. So in that sense, we already find women or organizations who are doing this and just need maybe some support, like training or resources or tools or connection points to make it happen. And also we do have to, when we try and identify participants for these programs, we do ask that question. There are some women that don't feel safe doing this type of work because they're worried that if people know that they're trying to fight terrorism, that they will then be at risk. And that's something that we have to consider when we're designing these programs. We have to make sure that nothing we do puts people in the spotlight so they feel at risk. So a lot of the work happens quietly. It happens at the community level in areas where some of this work is already happening, but they just need a little bit of extra support.
Great, thank you. We do have something on the live stream. Allie?
Yes, absolutely. So, oh, we have a couple of them. Hold on. Oh dear, I just
Oh well.
just typed it. Lost the first one. Hold on. I just have to go up a little bit. I'm sorry, Berkeley. Here it is. So Berkeley says that women can be a big focus to work with because fathers aren't around a lot. So the mothers can influence the children and the ideas can be passed on generation to generation. And then, okay, is it Isla from Roy? I hope I said your name right. Wants to know, do you think that these communities are thinking the effects of what they're doing, oh gosh, to their neighbors by not forgiving them, like you said, oftentimes turning their children into violence and our terrorist groups?
Question. Okay.
So I think both of those are really, really key points. I didn't so much talk about the role of women as mothers, but I should mention that nearly every woman that we work with is a mother as well as maybe leading an organization. And the effects on their children is like the number one thing that they're always thinking about and wanting a more peaceful world for their kids than maybe the one in which they're living in. USAP has done some work on women preventing violent extremism that looks specifically at the role of mothers to make sure that in their house, they're having conversations with their kids about these issues and trying to make sure, like it was said, that generation to generation, these issues don't continue. On the question about, I'm just reading it again to make sure I understand. I think that, yeah, I think that the women are, not just women, but the whole community, the police, who you find police women as well. It's not just policemen, but women who are police, men who are police, young people, women, mothers and fathers, religious leaders, that they are thinking about the effects of not forgiving their neighbors. But sometimes it's really hard if you're in a situation where you've lost a loved one. It's really hard to move on quickly, and sometimes that healing takes some time. But thankfully, by having some of these groups, like I mentioned, where they can talk about their issues, that healing will go a little bit faster, and they're able to not turn to violence because of their anger. But yeah, it's such an important point, and something that it takes time to work through.
Great. We have about 5-ish minutes or so. So if you want, I'm thinking maybe a few final points, and then we can do another round of questions, particularly for Ms. Wallner-Drake's class. Since you came in a little late, we'll, you know, if people need to leave, that's fine. But if you need to ask a few extra questions, we can take those at the end. So Nicoletta, where do we go from here? What's up next?
I feel like I've covered so much information, and some of it is a little sad, but the thing the last message that I want you guys to really take from this is that I've been working at USAP for 8 years and on this project for 6 years. So it's not an immediate result, but I can say with full confidence that these types of programs are working to prevent violence and to prevent terrorism and to build peace around the world. I'm committed to doing this work in Kenya, but my colleagues, all 300 of us in this building, are doing it around the world in partnership with other organizations and other people who are committed to peace. So working at USIP for me is incredible because I see positive things, I see peace happening, and I see violence decreasing. So I just wanted to leave you guys with the message that, I mean, it's our motto at USAP, so I'm not trying to sound like I'm like the spokesperson for USAP, but it is possible to see peace happen. It just takes time, and it takes good partnerships and commitment. But I hope that you guys have learned a little bit about how to work with women But that's just one example. You can look on our website, you can read some of our materials. We're doing this work with a variety of people, different actors around the world. So that's just one little example of something that can be done.
You know, it's really good to hear some positive news. So I love that. So let's take a few minutes just to do a final go around, see if classrooms have final questions, or even about Nicoletta and how she got involved in the work, and you know, that kind of question too, because we may have some budding diplomats in these groups that that would want to get involved in this work. So let's go ahead and start with Gardner. They're thinking.
Oh, hi. All right, I'm Lauren. We don't really have many questions, but we wanted to say thank you for presenting such a positive view on what kind of work you're doing, as well as kind of giving us some insight into what's going on in the rest of the world, taking us out of our little bubble of small town Gardner, Montana, and just kind of opening our eyes a little bit to the work that you guys are doing. Thank you.
Lauren, I have a question for you. It's Lauren, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. How many in your classroom would maybe consider international work as a career pathway, do you think? Maybe we could have them raise their hands, or anybody?
No pressure.
1, 2, 3, 5. At least 6.
Yeah.
There's only like 10 people in here, so yeah.
So the majority of the class.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Okay, thank you. That is fascinating. Thanks.
I also want to thank you for your really excellent thoughts and questions to my presentation. I really appreciated it.
Yeah. Let's go ahead to St. Charles, and any final questions, comments? And I'm going to ask the same question of you all, if any of you are considering international work. So go ahead, St. Charles.
Who's doing international work? Raise your hand. Who wants to do it?
I think that would be amazing. Yeah. How many, can I ask in Mr. Moore's class, how many of you are tribal members, I believe? You're on the Crow Reservation, correct? Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, and everybody in here.
So you have sovereignty too as tribal members. So that's kind of an interesting concept. So great. Did you have any final questions or comments from anybody there?
Yes, this is Mr. Moore again. We did discuss one thing. Is we're talking about the Horn of Africa, but someone did bring it up. What are like groups like this actually doing in the United States to help the women empower themselves here?
I know there are organizations in the US that try and work with young women who want to go into politics to build their confidence, to help them in public speaking, just to make them feel like they're able to know what they have to do to get into politics, to maybe become a member of Congress, a representative or a senator. There are, I'm trying to think of other, that's the biggest example that comes to mind.
National Action Plan.
There is, so one thing I didn't mention, there is legislation that is based on a the United Nations resolution, but all the countries many countries have signed on to it. That's called the National Action Plan for Women, Peace, and Security. And this is basically a country's commitment to working with women in peace and conflict in their own countries. So Kenya has signed on to it, and the United States has signed on to it. And so there are organizations in the US that work to make sure that legislation that Congress passed is implemented. So the State Department, there are US agencies that are working on this. And I don't have details, but I can look if there's interest, or if you guys wanna write to me, I can think through some of these organizations and share that information with you.
Great. The other thing I want to throw out to all of the classes, but Mr. Moore's class especially, is a challenge, because we've been working with the USIP on a peacemaking challenge, but also I know that they have amazing tools on their website that teachers can use in the classroom to develop some of these skills, and then you guys are in charge. Take it, take it on as a school project. But get some of these great resources that teach, conflict resolution and empowerment and all of this stuff that is out there, because I think you would have a great opportunity to start at your local level with some of the help that these people can give. They know those strategies that work and are helpful.
That's a great. We have toolkits available for teachers, but also for students that our peace education team who's helped make this possible, this conversation possible. And they're on the website, but I can make sure that our team sends them after this conversation so that they're available.
100%. That'd be great. Okay, let's go ahead and go to Bozeman for some questions.
All right, so Bozeman is just starting to study development in this human geography class. We just started yesterday. And so gender is definitely something we're gonna look at, but also I was wondering if you could speak to the economics of the situation as well, in the sense of poverty and terrorism, and kind of how the economics factors in there, and if you guys deal with that as well.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I will start by saying that's through this project, we don't directly address the economic factor, but economics, as you mentioned, is kind of an underlying, it's a driver of some of these issues. So one thing we see is that in communities where there is really high unemployment, where there isn't much access to jobs or education, that's when you find that young people are sometimes looking for outlets to make money, or outlets to express some of their frustrations. And that's sometimes where terrorists will go and try to recruit people to join their terrorist group. So a stable economy, access to jobs, access to education, so that even the basics of development and a functioning economy are key to stabilizing and making sure that peace stays in a community. We don't, USIP doesn't do things like try and provide access to small businesses or loans or anything like that. There are organizations that tackle this issue by trying to help stabilize the economy. That's just not the side that USIP works on. We work more on the dialogues, the prevention, and capacity building. But economics is huge, and the spillover effects of terrorism is that then people don't want to go visit these countries that have a prevalence of terrorist attacks. So we were talking earlier about the incredible safaris that someone can do in Kenya. Kenya is working really, really hard to make sure that it's safe so that people can come and do these safaris, because they rely on tourism for their economy. So it's a cycle.
Great. We have one left from Roy.
We do. Berkeley has a question, and well, first of all, Berkeley says, thank you from Roy. And then the question is, what are some programs that you're currently going on in Uganda? What are the job opportunities in Africa, specifically Uganda?
I think Berkeley wants to go.
Yeah, Berkeley should definitely take a trip there.
She has.
Well, yes, I think more people should go to Uganda. Okay, so some of the work that we're doing in Uganda, the great thing about this project that I talked about in Kenya is that USIP received funding from our partner, the State Department, to expand this project into Uganda, into Tanzania, and into Ethiopia. And those are 3 countries that border Kenya. And we're trying to see if we can make this network of women working in Kenya grow to be a network of women working across the Horn of Africa. So that's a really exciting opportunity, something that we're going to be working on for the next few years. But so one thing is that we're starting to do this work in Uganda. Women will be training other women to identify potential signs of terrorism and to host these dialogues in their communities. USIP also works with one of the biggest universities in Uganda. It's called Makerere University, and we work to support their research and their publications, and then we publish them with them on our website and on their website. So USIP likes to support local researchers, students, people who have their PhDs, and we like to support local research. That's another example of what we're doing. But Uganda is growing really, really quickly. Their economy is growing, their democracy is growing. So there are jobs. If someone wants to go work in Uganda one day, there are many, many jobs, and I'm happy. I know some people who are doing great work there, so I'm happy to link you up with them if that's something you want to do in the future.
Great. Well, Nicoletta, I think we're out of time, but I'd like to bring on Chris Hislop, who's the new executive director of the Montana World Affairs Council. Chris.
Greetings, everybody. First, Nicoletta, thank you so much. That was incredibly compelling and interesting, and thanks for bringing a little bit of your world to our world here in Montana. And thanks to all the classrooms who are engaged. Incredible questions and engagement. I really appreciate that. And thanks to Inspired Classroom and our colleagues here for helping us bring this together from the Montana World Affairs Council. I've just begun my work here. I'm new to Montana, but I've been welcomed all along in everything I've been doing, and certainly here in Inspired Classroom, and I'm looking forward to more work with them. I just want to say one thing in closing, Nicoletta. I really appreciate what you said. You talked about USIP, and you said it takes time, partnership, and commitment. And I think that's a really a great thing to say and a good thing to remind ourselves and to our students and classrooms around Montana that in issues like this, these big international issues that can seem so confusing and so complex, but really, you know, they're the problems we all share. And those solutions are found in those three things that Nicoletta said. We have to take some time. These kinds of things don't get resolved, you know, in a very short period. They take a lot of time, and you have to invest that time. Nicoletta talked about partnership. That means you need to work with people. These kinds of things aren't solved by one person sitting behind a computer typically, and not only working with people, but probably people who don't look like you, who don't act like you, and may not think like you, or may in fact disagree with you. But that's just the way that these things are, and that's the way that these issues are worked through. And lastly, the commitment, which is a very important part of anything that we do. Students know that. Students know that if they're athletes and they're not committed to their sport, it's not going to work out for them. If you're not committed to your studies, it's not going to work out. So it does take those three really important things. So thanks a lot for highlighting that, Nicoletta. Thanks again to all of the classrooms. I look forward to more of these in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you for having me.
Everybody have a good day.
Bye-bye.